This is a 2012 Aston Martin Cygnet, and it's the most ridiculous exotic car ever made. This may not look like an Aston Martin. It looks like a tiny hatchback, but it's both. You probably know Aston Martin for its beautiful, luxurious, exotic cars and its James Bond heritage, but 10 years ago, they made this, the Cygnet tiny hatchback, one of the stupidest cars of all time. And today, I've always wanted to review it, and I'm going to. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free with no fees and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some great sales recently, including this Volkswagen Phaeton W12, wonderfully quirky, sold for $18,000. This BMW 3 Series wagon brought almost $28,000. We've done great with BMW wagons on Cars and Bids, and this Sprinter van brought over $64,000. We've also done great with cool vans on Cars and Bids. So, if you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it, with daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this Cygnet courtesy of the AUTOPIAN, which is a new car website for cool car content founded by Jason Torchinsky and David Tracy, who are two excellent automotive journalists. The AUTOPIAN will be a great website for their wacky and interesting and cool automotive-related content, and you should definitely check it out because David Tracy and Jason Torchinsky are two of my favorite car people in existence. So check out the AUTOPIAN after watching this video. So let's talk Cygnet. Aston Martin created this car to comply with European emissions regulations that apply to an automaker's entire fleet of vehicles. While Ferrari can balance out the emissions of its exotic sports cars with its parent company Fiat, and Porsche can do the same with Volkswagen, Aston Martin doesn't have a parent company, so it can't cancel out the V8 and V12 emissions from its exotic cars quite as easily, and so you have the Cygnet. And today, I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the Aston Martin Cygnet and show you its many quirks and features. Then, I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the very quirky Cygnet with a little overview of exactly what this car is. So, like I mentioned earlier, this car was made to bring Aston into compliance with emissions regulations in Europe. We call this a compliance car in the auto industry. Aston Martin's lineup was full of V8s and V12s, and emission and pollution was too high. And like I said, Ferrari has Fiat to balance them out, and Lamborghini and Porsche have Volkswagen, but Aston Martin doesn't have a parent company to help lower its overall fleet average emissions, and so they had to make this. Now, in the modern era, if you're looking to lower your fleet emissions, of course, you just come out with an electric version of one of your exotic cars, and you keep your same performance and excitement. But the Cygnet came out back in 2011. Electric cars weren't really around. That idea wasn't even on the table. So instead, they decided to make a very efficient, very low pollution city car, the Cygnet. But of course, Aston Martin didn't actually go out and develop their own tiny city car and engineer a small fuel-efficient powertrain. That wouldn't have really made sense. Instead, they based the Cygnet off an existing car. Now, on the outside, it looks like a smart car, but it isn't. Instead, the Cygnet is based on the Toyota IQ, which was an incredibly tiny, smart car-like vehicle from Toyota, which was actually sold here in North America as the Scion IQ, but it also served as the basis for the Aston Martin Cygnet. But while the IQ started around $13,000 as a new car in Europe back in 2011, the Cygnet started around $40,000. And so, to justify that threefold price increase and to help it actually be an Aston Martin, they had to make a lot of changes. And so today, I'm going to take you on a thorough tour of all the upgrades Aston Martin made to the Cygnet in order to Aston Martinify a tiny entry-level subcompact Toyota city car. So we start the Aston Martinification of the Toyota IQ up front, where you see, of course, an Aston Martin badge, which is no surprise. But more interestingly, you have an Aston Martin grille. This is the exact shape of grille that Aston was using on its sports cars at the time. The Vantage, the DB9, and the Cygnet all had the same grille. They wanted to tie it into other Aston Martins, and so the grille was an obvious way to do that. But my very favorite change up front in this car is actually on the hood, where you can see these vents, these two hood vents mounted directly in the center to let this powertrain breathe. Now, Aston Martin was making the V12 Vantage at the time the Cygnet was on sale, and it had these big pronounced hood vents for heat dissipation, and I guess Aston decided to also stick similar vents on the Cygnet to kind of tie it into the Vantage and other Aston Martin models. They are not functional, of course. You open up the hood and you look underneath and you can see they're not actually even open to allow for heat dissipation or airflow. They're just there for style to help this look like a true Aston Martin. And next up, around the side of the Cygnet, Aston Martin made some more changes to the Toyota IQ to Aston Martinify it. Probably the most obvious is right here, this side grille with this silver chrome strip going down the side and into the door panel. That was a common feature of Aston Martin models at the time, and obviously it wasn't included on the Toyota IQ, but Aston added it to the Cygnet to make it look Aston Martin. Then, of course, there were the wheels. Most IQ models came with steel wheels and hubcaps, but all Cygnets had alloy wheels, and there were a few different designs you could choose from to beautify your tiny Aston Martin. And also on the side of the car, on the door handle, you can see a little chrome strip has been added that says Cygnet, just to remind you of your special Aston Martin every time you go to open the door. And next up, speaking of Cygnet badging on the outside of this car, you have another one back here, Cygnet, mounted on the tailgate and printed rather large and in chrome. And in case you're wondering, a Cygnet is a baby swan. Now, at the time this car came out, Aston Martin was heavily marketing its swan-winged doors that would open up a little bit on its sports cars, and that was a cool feature. And so the Cygnet was like a baby version of the swan, which is actually kind of clever if you think about it. That is where the name came from. Now, also around back, you have an Aston Martin logo in the center, as you can see. That's not really all that surprising. And you also have Aston Martin style taillights. You can see them here, very distinctive Aston Martin, which is to say they have this special shape, a C on one side and sort of a backward C on the other, and they're totally clear, which went along with other Aston Martin models at the time. You can see here clear taillights in this exact same shape on Aston sports cars, their exotic cars, and also on the Cygnet. So that's all the stuff they wanted you to see when you saw the Cygnet. You walked up to this car and you saw all those details and you thought, maybe this really is a true Aston Martin city car. However, there were also a few things on the outside that they didn't really want you to see. One of them relates to those taillights. You can see they make kind of the Aston Martin shape, and they have this body-colored panel right in the center. But on Aston Martin sports cars, that body-colored panel goes all the way in to the central curve of the taillights. Not so here, because in the Cygnet, the center part of the taillight isn't actually functional. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't light up, and it doesn't have that painted panel in between. It's just a dummy meant to kind of look like an Aston Martin taillight, even though it isn't. And then there's the glass. You can see printed on the glass you have this Aston Martin logo, rather large and obvious because it's covering up the standard stamp where the Toyota logo would be on this glass because it's really a Toyota supplier, but they convinced him to stamp Aston so it didn't look embarrassing. And speaking of putting Aston Martin over Toyota in this car, it's the same situation on the key, which you can see here. This is just a regular Toyota keyless remote key, but it's encased in like an Aston Martin plastic casing with an Aston logo on it. And I suspect if you took that casing off, you would just find a Toyota logo on the key because they just snapped the Aston stuff over it and called it a day. Not exactly high luxury like you'd expect from an Aston Martin. But unquestionably, the largest Toyota-related disappointment from this car came with the powertrain. The Toyota IQ used a 1.3-liter four-cylinder that made about 95 horsepower. The Aston Martin Cygnet used a 1.3-liter four-cylinder that made about 95 horsepower. Ultimately, the engine is the whole reason that Aston Martin had to create this car. They needed something that would offset the emissions and fuel economy from its sports cars, so they couldn't really mess with the powertrain and give it more power, a bigger engine, or a better exhaust note. They couldn't screw with any of that stuff because that was the whole point. Now, the benefit was you got almost 40 miles per gallon in this car. It was very efficient and obviously a lot less polluty than Aston Martin exotic sports cars. But the drawback was you were driving around in a 95 horsepower front-wheel drive Aston Martin at the same time the brand was making the DBS. They had that and this in the lineup together. And this was therefore not exactly the pinnacle of Aston Martin. Quite the opposite. And by the way, remember what I said earlier about pricing. The Toyota IQ started around $13,000. This was around $40,000, and the two vehicles shared the same powertrain, even though the Aston was 3 times more expensive. It's not like this was some high-performance version. They had the same engine, but for 3 times the money. So then you're thinking, how did Aston Martin justify this? How did they convince people to spend 3 times the cost of the Toyota just to have some Aston Martin badging? The short answer is they didn't, and this car was a massive sales failure. It was only on the market for 3 years, and it was a total flop. But they had an idea on how to attract customers and get them to pay big money, and that was to create a truly luxurious interior, a luxury city car, which actually I think is a pretty good idea, and here's how they executed it. We start with the door panel, which as you can see has a floral image through the center, like a picture of flowers right in the middle, right in the center of the door panel. That's not something you're going to see again. You also have extremely high quality leather in here, this beautiful saddle brown leather above and below this floral image, and you have some pink stitching throughout the leather in order to tie it into the flower and match that image and of course the purplish exterior color of this car. You have a very luxurious door panel. And the changes to the interior went much, much further than just the door panel. First off, look around this interior and you'll see leather everywhere. On every surface, the dashboard, the steering wheel, the seats, the center, there's leather all over the place. And not cheap Toyota leather. In fact, Toyota didn't even offer leather upholstery on this car, the IQ. It's all beautiful Aston Martin leather. Plush and gorgeous and high quality, and it has the smell. I owned an Aston Martin model from around this era, and there was a distinctive smell to the leather that it had. This car has it too. When you open the door and climb inside, you would think you're climbing into an Aston Martin if you were just using your nose, because they used the same high quality materials as other Astons. And frankly, beyond just leather in the places where you'd expect it, they really went above and beyond to add quality to this interior wherever possible. And there's some great details in here. For instance, this ugly plastic trim on the side of the door sill has been covered up with leather. You can see it here, beautiful stitched leather, which would just be crappy plastic on the Toyota. Same deal with the side of the seat. You can see Alcantara here, which looks very nice. In the Toyota, this would just be plastic. Now, this isn't a surface you're going to sit on or feel very often, but it's something you see when you open the door, and so they changed it. They wanted to make everything more luxurious in this interior. And next up, another good example of that is the area around the gear selector. Normally kind of a cheap plastic, but here this beautiful brushed aluminum that looks really high quality. And this is actual metal. You touch it, it's cold, it feels and sounds like metal. This looks fantastic. Another nice upgrade to this interior. And you have a similar piece of that trim in the center control stack. You can see here in the middle around the climate vents, again, not just a cheap crappy plastic in here, but this high quality aluminum that just looks a lot nicer than what you get in a normal car like this. And there's more, of course. Take a look at the parking brake. In the IQ, it was just this ugly plastic thing you pulled up, but here it's fully wrapped in leather. Not just the boot, but also the brake itself, since you'll be grabbing it, feeling it, and so they wanted it to look and feel nice. And how about the floor mats? You can see they are trimmed on the outside entirely in this gorgeous saddle leather like the interior, and in the center you can see this sort of shaggy, plush, comfortable carpeting, not just your typical durable, ugly floor mat material. They even made the floor mats nice in this car. And also on the floor mats, you can see they're trimmed with this pink stitching going all the way around, just like you saw on the door panel. That stitching is in the floor mats, and in fact, it's in a lot of places in this interior. You can see it in the center control stack. All this beautiful leather is stitched with this same matching pink, and it's even over on the dashboard. This caricature line on the leather on the passenger side of the dashboard is trimmed in this pink stitching to match everything else. And of course, you also have this stitching on the seats. You can see it here. Looks pretty nice, very beautiful, as you might expect. But the seats have more to them than just that. They also have this gorgeous patterned leather. You can see it in the seat back and in the seat bottom. This gorgeous cutout leather design with circles and ridges, and it looks fantastic. Very high quality luxury car on the seats in the Cygnet. Now you also have an Aston Martin logo in the headrest, which looks very nice and luxurious. And probably most noticeable, on the very top on the headrest, you have this pattern which looks like a flower and printed into the seat. Again, cutouts and stitching to give it a really, really high quality luxury look. And I presume to match the flower theme that we saw earlier on the door panel. And speaking of that flower theme, we must next move on to the headliner. So the pillars on the side of the interior, you can see Alcantara, which you'd expect from a high quality luxury car. Going up the side to the ceiling, all Alcantara, and it looks great. And that's the same deal with the sun visors. Again, Alcantara, and they look fantastic. But the headliner itself, once again, has these flower pictures all printed on it. The entire ceiling of the car is this same flower picture design that you saw over on the door panel. And it's quite interesting and quite unusual, but that's what's going on in here. Flowers on the doors, the ceiling, and embossed into the leather on the seats. Now, this floral design that's sort of a theme in here comes to this car courtesy of Q, which is Aston Martin's name for its like special projects division. You can see evidence of the Q customization throughout this car. In the center console, you have this little Q badge, almost looks like a belt buckle, with pink leather straps on either side to match some of the pink trim in this car. You also have this little Q logo on the door sill, reminding you that this car is not just an ordinary Cygnet, but instead one that has been made custom by Q. And you even have a little Q badge on the door itself on the side, letting outside observers know that this is no ordinary Cygnet, if there is such a thing. Instead, it's one that's been tweaked by Q to make it even more special and floral. And there are so many more interesting and kind of cool luxury touches throughout this interior. If you didn't know what to look for, you might miss them. For example, the Toyota IQ was sold without a glove box. It just didn't have one. But for Aston Martin's luxury version, that wouldn't do. So they added this little clip over where a glove box would be, this rather large like storage clip where you could put papers, and you can see it has two pink leather straps to sort of hold it in place to match the rest of this interior, which is nice attention to detail in here. And there are other little details changed throughout. For example, the steering wheel center, you can see has this same saddle brown leather as the rest of the car, which adds a nice luxury touch. And it's the same situation on the gauge cluster. The shroud above the gauge cluster has the saddle brown with pink stitching, which I guarantee the Toyota IQ didn't offer. And next up, another nice luxury detail touch in this interior is on the gear selector. Selector itself. You can see the saddle brown leather, which looks nice, but also this aluminum panel with an Aston Martin logo on it to improve the luxury of this interior even when you're just shifting into drive. And by the way, speaking of the transmission in this car, it was offered with either a CVT automatic, which obviously this one has, or a 5-speed manual if you wanted to row your own gears in your Cygnet. But anyway, next up, moving on to some other nice luxury touches and changes in this interior. Another one is in the gauge cluster. You can see the gauges themselves have an Aston Martin logo printed inside, along with this sort of cool and interesting design that makes it a little more distinctive and a little bit more special than you might expect. And Aston Martin even went to the trouble of taking the belt buckles, which in basically all cars are plastic, and wrapping them in leather, this same saddle brown leather on both sides and front. The belt buckle is wrapped in it to make it more luxurious and beautiful. Even the grab handles to help you get out of the car mounted on the ceiling are wrapped in leather in the part where you would grab to make them feel and look more luxurious. Everything was thought about and improved in this car. And I gotta say, it actually is a pretty substantial transformation in this interior. I got in this car expecting to just kind of make fun of it, but looking around, it really does feel like a high quality, high luxury car in a way that I wasn't really expecting. Aston totally went top to bottom in this interior and just improved practically everything. And it's kind of funny, I was recently driving a Subaru Solterra, which is like a Subaru version of a Toyota, and that car is filled with Toyota in the interior, and you can tell this thing, I'm not sure that you'd be able to tell that it's a Toyota very easily, because Aston has so thoroughly made changes to hide that and luxurify the space. And indeed, as you sit in here and look around and see all the touches, you almost start to justify that $40,000 price tag for an Aston Martin luxury city car. That is until you remember the powertrain. But it is worth pointing out that not everything in this car became luxurious quite so smoothly. There are still some areas where you look and you see that it just wasn't upgraded all that well. One good example is the steering wheel. Now, Toyota's logo is basically a circle, and Aston Martin's obviously isn't. But rather than create a new steering wheel, they just stuck the Aston logo into the circle where the Toyota logo would be, which doesn't really look all that luxurious or classy. And how about this for a not very luxurious afterthought? Aston Martin in this era really wanted all of its cars to have a navigation system, which makes sense. It was a high-end luxury brand, and that's a feature that buyers had come to expect. But the IQ wasn't offered with a navigation system, which meant they would have had to redesign the whole center console to get one in. But they didn't do that. Instead, they gave you this little post to the left of the steering wheel that allowed you to mount a Garmin navigation unit that they gave you when you bought the car. So you got a brand new, beautiful Aston Martin and a stick-on post on the dashboard where you could mount a Garmin, which wasn't exactly a great integration of a navigation system into this car, and kind of added to the whole image that this all was just one big afterthought joke, a tacked-on Garmin nav system. And there were other little ways that you could tell this car had been sort of morphed from a Toyota and not completely. One was the stalks coming off the steering column. The turn signal and wiper stalk were borrowed straight from the IQ and not changed. They look very Toyota. And that's also true of a few other controls, like the power mirror controls and the power windows. That all came from Toyota and wasn't really changed. Same deal with the seats. They made them very luxurious and beautiful, but they didn't make them power. The IQ was never offered with power seats, so Aston Martin couldn't exactly develop some, and this car has manual seats, which isn't exactly very luxurious or opulent or extravagant like you might expect from an Aston Martin. With that said, it does have heated seats. You can see the control right here, left or right, and you can turn on heated seats in this car, which is a nice luxury touch, even though they are manually operated. Next up, another drawback carried over from Toyota, the Cygnet only has one cup holder, this one here in the center. Small, shallow, and just one, which isn't really what you want from your luxurious city car, but the IQ only had one cup holder, and Aston didn't want to redesign the center console, so the Cygnet does too. too. But the real drawback in this car was the control for the stereo system. If you look into the center control stack here, you can see the only controls are for the climate functions, air conditioning, heat. There's no stereo controls in here. You do have a CD slot at the very top, which you can see, but no stereo controls. So how do you control that stuff? The answer is only the driver is able to do so using controls mounted on the steering wheel. And the stereo controls are only these. One switch and one button controls the whole stereo, and that's it. The switch moves up or down to control volume, or left or right to control next track or next station if you're listening to the radio. Meanwhile, the button right below that says mode power. If you tap it, it changes the mode. So like what you're listening to, AM, FM, CD, that sort of thing. If you hold it down, it turns on or off the stereo. It's the power button, and that's it. Those are your only stereo controls. You can't adjust the bass, the treble. You can't focus the speakers in a certain seat or area. You only had those controls, and your only display for the stereo was in the gauge cluster on this tiny little black and white screen, only visible to the driver, that was shared with other information, including the odometer. This pixelated, crappy screen was all you had for your stereo display in this luxurious Aston Martin. Certainly a bit of a drawback for people buying this car, but that's how the IQ came, and so that's how the Cygnet had to come too. But one of its most interesting aspects was the back seat. Yes, this tiny little city car, only 120 inches long, a foot longer than a smart car, has a back seat somehow. And as you can imagine, getting in is a bit of a disaster. You push this seat forward and then you're intended to climb in, and I barely fit in the back seat. Even with the front seat all the way forward, it's pretty tight back here. With the front seat in place, you can see there is absolutely no rear seat room in this car at all. I have no idea why they bothered to include back seats, but they did. Incredibly tiny back seats that make this a four-seater city car. Now, it's worth pointing out the Toyota IQ and Scion IQ also had the back seat, so it's not like Aston Martin added them, but it was an unusual factor of this car that made it a little bit more practical than a smart car if you could fit, and nobody really can. Now, as far as the Cygnet is concerned, the back seat was luxurified just like the front, although not quite as nicely. You do have this beautiful saddle brown leather like you had up front, but you don't have those cool little leather designs like the flower in the headrest or the other patterns on the bottom and the backrest. But you do have some other nice luxury touches, including the pink stitching back here. You can see it in the seat, looking good and luxurious. You also have this saddle brown leather on an armrest on the sides of the back seats, and once again, pink stitching to make it look nice, as you might expect. And Aston Martin even went to the trouble to wrap the belt buckles in back with leather, just like they did in front. You can see them here, leather wrapped belt buckles, again to increase the luxury of the rear seats. And one other luxurious item I mentioned back here is, again, the headliner. I mentioned Alcantara on the pillars and sides up front. Same deal in back. You have this luxurious, high-quality Alcantara that does make for a relatively high-class experience. And of course, if you're able to sit back and relax in the back seat, you can also look up and see the flowers, which I guess enhances your luxuriousness and your experience even more. Now, as you might have guessed, the addition of back seats in this car robs you from the ability to have any usable cargo space at all. And I mean any cargo space. You pop open the tailgate and you can see there is literally no cargo space back here. There are a few inches behind the rear seats. There's room for practically nothing. I don't think I've ever seen a car with such small cargo space ever in all of my reviews. Now, it is worth noting that if you're looking for more cargo space, and you are, you can lift up the cargo floor with this little hoop, and there's actually a small compartment underneath with a little more tiny cargo space. So maybe you put a couple of pens on top and a couple of pencils in the bottom. You don't have to commingle, but that is about all you can get back here. Now, of course, you can lower the seats for more cargo space, but if you press the latch to fold down the seat, you push it forward and the headrest gets in the way of actually folding down, meaning every time you want to drop the seats, which is often, you're going to have to pull out the headrest manually. So you do that, and then you press the latch to lower the seats, and then the seat back itself is preventing it from getting all the way down because it gets stuck on the front seat. point. That is how little space there is in this tiny car. It's hard to even fold down the seats for more cargo space. But if you move the front seats forward, you can get the back seats down and get that cargo space you desire. Overall, regarding the back seats in this car, there's just not room for them. They just don't have the space for back seats, and yet it has them anyway for very tiny people and to provide a little advantage over the two-seater smart car for people who want a really practical city car that can carry some small people in a pinch. Now, one more thing I want to say about the Cygnet before I get behind the wheel. All of these Cygnet models were powered by the same engine, 1.3 liter four-cylinder with about 95 horsepower, and it was just a disappointment except for one. One Aston Martin customer convinced Aston in the Q department, the special projects department, to make him a Cygnet with a V8. So they used the 4.7 liter V8 from the Aston Martin V8 Vantage. They stuffed it in a Cygnet. It had massive fender flares to accommodate the wider tires it had to have, and they created a V8 Cygnet, and that's what they called it, the V8 Cygnet. Now, this customer signed an agreement with Aston Martin, making them promise that they would never build another one. He only agreed to buy the car and commission it and pay for it if they would agree that it would be a one-of-one. But there indeed is a one-of-one V8 powered Aston Martin Cygnet out there somewhere. Unfortunately, this one has to make do with the standard four-cylinder. And so that's the Aston Martin Cygnet. What a bizarre and weird vehicle. Anyway, now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, time to drive the Aston Martin Cygnet. Now, as you might imagine, this will be the least interesting part of this video because they didn't change the powertrain or really the suspension or just about anything else, so the performance is the same as a tiny Toyota hatchback, and that's what I'll be reviewing now. But I do want to mention two notable things that I think most people might be interested in. One, this car was the 2012 Geneva Auto Show display car. I think that's when Aston decided to expand the availability of the Cygnet outside the UK, and so they showed it at Geneva to announce that it would be coming to Europe. Whether or not that was a good thing, I don't know. And in fact, if you look closely at the door sill where it says Q by Aston Martin, it specifically says that this car was prepared for the 2012 Geneva Auto Show. So this is a auto show debut car Aston Martin. Too bad it's this one. Now, the other interesting thing about this car is how it's here. You're probably wondering, what is it doing here? This car's only 10 years old. It doesn't qualify for the 25-year exemption, so how did it get to the States? The answer is this car is imported under show or display, which is the rule that was created, law that was created based to allow very special, low production, low volume cars to come in. Now, normally cars like this wouldn't be allowed under show or display, but it's based on production volume, and they only made, I don't know, 1,000. It's a really low production car, this one, so it's allowed in under show or display. And the owner of this car, who runs the Galpin Auto dealerships here in Los Angeles, he's into the weird and quirky and interesting cars, and this is one of them, and he wanted it, and they have an Aston Martin dealer as well, so he got this one. So that's probably more important than the actual driving experience of this car, which frankly isn't really all that exciting or special in any way. Now, I'm not exactly sure if they did do any tuning to this car to make it more luxurious and comfortable, but I can tell you from a performance and acceleration standpoint, they absolutely did not. It's been years since I've been inside a Scion IQ, but the power number is the same and the car is the same, so I mean, it's not like it's fast. There's not much to this. You get a CVT automatic and a very small engine, admittedly in a very small car, but you're still not getting amazing performance. Now, handling also hasn't really been improved. I don't think they did any real suspension tuning or upgrading to make this car like steer or handle dramatically better. That wasn't really the goal of the car. It was just to make it a more luxurious vehicle. So the question then is, did they do anything to make it more luxurious from a driving perspective? And I'm not entirely sure. It does seem to me that it's considerably quieter in here compared to a Scion IQ. It seems to me like it's more relaxing and luxurious and nicer, but that could just be the power of suggestion based on the Aston Martin brand name, but also the really high quality materials. I'm sitting in this nice leather, I'm looking at nice leather and aluminum and stitching, and I might think to myself, oh, I'd have to do a back-to-back with an IQ, but nobody has one of those, and nobody really wants to talk about that car anyway. But it does feel maybe a little bit more luxurious and a little bit nicer. Now, in terms of the ownership experience, I gotta say, behind this car, I think it'd be very interesting. The driver's window is broken. That's the only real problem with the car. It doesn't roll down. It needs a new regulator. And I want to be a fly on the wall in the Toyota dealership when they show up with this to get a new window regulator. I think that's going to be a fantastic day. Either they're going to freak out or they're just not going to know, and they're going to treat it like a Scion IQ. But for the rest of it, you know, it's a Toyota powertrain. It's Toyota everything. This is the cheapest, most cost-effective way to own an Aston Martin. And I'm not just talking about purchase price, because you can get a DB7 a lot cheaper than these cars. I'm talking about ownership cost. This is a cheap to own Aston Martin. Now, you may be wondering, what were they thinking? I mean, do they actually think these would sell? The numbers I read were that they thought they'd sell 2,000 of them in the UK, and they only ended up selling 150. And then they obviously sold some in mainland Europe as well, because this one's left-hand drive, so it wasn't sold in the UK. And that was true. There were some sold in Paris and that sort of thing. The concept of it is not a bad one. In the UK and in cities on the European continent, tight cities, you have to have these small cars in order to park places and go places and fit into spaces. I mean, almost everybody who lives in these cities has these tiny cars. But a lot of people who live in these cities are very wealthy. In Paris and London and Munich, you know, Barcelona, they want nice cars. So the concept of a tiny luxury car actually makes some sense. And I've actually seen these on the road. I've seen 2 of these in Monaco, I saw 1 in Istanbul, and I've seen 3 in London. They're not totally uncommon or out of the realm. People are owning them, not ironically. Like, it works. They have nice cars in the garage for the weekends, for drives, for events, but they want to drive around town in something nice and luxurious as well, but still be able to park. And there's some sense to that, and that made some sense. But obviously, it's very expensive for a Toyota IQ. So there's some logic to it, and then there's some massive downside. Now, interestingly, these still cost around $30,000, $40,000. They've kept their prices pretty well. I think because it's just such a quirky, iconic car, and because they just made so few of them. People are still buying them. They think they're interesting, and I would love to have one someday when they become legal here. What a weird, really strange vehicle that I have always wanted to check out, and I'm so thrilled that I finally have. And so that's the Aston Martin Cygnet. This might just be the single strangest exotic car of all time, certainly in the top 5. And I have always wanted to check it out. And I'm thrilled that I was able to spend the day with one of my automotive heroes. Anyway, now it's time to give the Cygnet a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 43 out of 100, which places the Cygnet here against cars that are totally irrelevant, basically, because frankly, nothing even comes close to rivaling the Cygnet for its purpose or execution. Frankly, the Cygnet is just plain bizarre and quite possibly the most insane example of a compliance car ever in the history of the car industry. I've always idolized the Cygnet for its sheer absurdity, and I've always wanted to see what it's like, and now I have. The nicest Scion IQ ever made, or maybe the weirdest Aston Martin.